Thank you for downloading the Start the Week podcast from BBC Radio 4. For more information, go to bbc.co.uk/Radio 4. Well, January is a time for stock-taking, reflection and sometimes remorse. That's true most obviously when it comes to bodies and bank accounts, but it also affects our emotions and our family lives. The Christmas break should, of course, be a time of family happiness, but it can also be a time of tension and confrontation. And January is notoriously a month of the year for breakups. So today we're going to be looking at family secrets. What's the difference between privacy and secrecy? How do we examine and explain ourselves? I'm going to try to give modern Britain's confessional culture some historical context. Alex Graham created the television programme Who Do You Think You Are? Sarah Dunant's novels have focused on dark corners of Renaissance families, and new ones about that famously functional family, the Borgias. Stephen Grosz is a psychoanalyst who is now telling stories, anonymous stories, but real ones, from his London therapy room. And we're going to be kicking off with Deborah Cohen, who's written a book, well, it's all in the title really, Family Secrets, Living with Shame from the Victorians to the Present Day. Just as we get started, everybody, we do live, it's often said, in a much more open and confessional culture. We've got all the social networking sites, we've got a more confessional style of television, perhaps. Do you think anything has really changed? Deb?
Definitely things have changed. So confession itself is very old. The Church of England long had the rule, none must, all may, some should. But really the mass market confession began to take shape in the 1930s with confessional contests in the tabloids and the rise of marriage therapy in the 1940s. So while I think that there's a difference in degree and in kind, in fact, confessional culture has a much older history.
Alex Graham, your TV programme, Who Do You Think You Are, actually appears in Deborah's book as part of the history of the confessional culture. So do you think things have changed?
I think they've changed by degree. Whether they've changed quantitatively, I'm not so sure. I think what we've seen is a kind of democratisation of confession, and I think that is not altogether a bad thing, although I can see I'm actually more concerned probably with the growth of celebrity culture than with confessional culture. And I think those two things sometimes get conflated when we talk about the media. And I think actually by and large what we call our confessional culture is a good thing. Celebrity culture, I think, is a more nuanced and difficult thing.
I really want to come back and talk about the difference between those two things later on. But Sarah Dunant, you know, you've obviously been steeped in the Renaissance and in earlier periods of family history where there are all kinds of public confession, voluntary and otherwise. Do you think we live in a particularly confessional time now?
We live in a publicly confessional time, in a media confessional time, whereas before shame and secrets were kept very underneath. I suppose my bigger question is whether or not shame is a useful thing to have within a society. And the more we confess, and in a sense the more we absolve by public confession, have we lost a social control of shame which actually is for the good?
It doesn't matter what you do as long as you stand up and you say, you know, I have sinned, I have done the wrong thing. Everybody then loves you again and you go back to life as normal. That's the problem, is it?
Well, I suspect if you were, for instance, to look at the kind of massive meltdown of finance in our country, and you were to look at how we moved from the word debt, which we saw as shame many years ago, into credit, which we saw as growth, and then you asked why bankers made such a hash of money that they didn't even feel belonged to them properly because money didn't mean the same thing, then you ask when all of that falls apart, why nobody is more shameful about it. So there are ways in which I think shame is quite a good thing in a society.
Well, there's yet another path through the forest that we will try to get to later on for that. Stephen, you know, for a long time the therapy room was where the doors closed and you were completely locked in a private space. What do you think, as a psychotherapist, about the more confessional, as I say, the sort of social networking culture where people seem to be much keener to tell everybody else and show pictures about what they've been doing?
I think actually that I think that things are maybe more complex. You know, if you look at Facebook or some of the social media, I actually think that people have a public self, but they can sometimes have a public-private self. Or a private self that's out there on Facebook, but then they'll also have a private self, which they'll bring to their therapist or they will have in their own life. which is not the same as the one which is out there in the world.
Mask behind mask behind mask.
Yes, but that people are maybe a bit more sophisticated and have learned. I think in the past maybe it was politicians or maybe celebrities had to learn to have a public self and a public-private self, and then their true private self. I think maybe nowadays all of us are starting to learn more about having to do that. And I think young people with Facebook and all the social media are doing much more of that. But I think that's not I think it's more sophisticated than just that the public and the private are becoming more blurred one with the other.
Yeah. Let's try and get a bit of historical context here. As I said earlier on, Deborah Cohen, your book is subtitled Living with Shame from the Victorians to the Present Day. You start talking about mixed-race children who were conceived when the British went to India and were hidden and sometimes acknowledged and sometimes not afterwards. But it's the Victorian divorce court that seems to really change notions of privacy above everything else.
Right. We think about the Victorians as having consecrated privacy, but in fact for the Victorians, secrets were very much the cornerstone of what they considered to be privacy. And the divorce court is such an interesting example of this because it's conceived of in 1857 when the Matrimonial Causes Act essentially enshrines it as a way to essentially make it possible for those innocents who were married to bad apples to free themselves from the yoke of marriage. But the entire idea is that English marriages are very happy and that, in fact, very few people are going to use the divorce court. And the moment of revelation really comes in the first 2 years of the divorce court.
Everybody wants to get there.
Exactly.
Not quite, but
there are as many divorces in the first 2 years of the divorce court as there have been in the entirety of the previous century. And moreover, revealed is a kind of catalogue of horrors of English domestic life that shocks people. I mean, Lady Chatterley's lover looks tame by comparison with a lot of what actually appears in the divorce court.
You were saying horrors there rather than whores. It was I wasn't
right,
sure whether
right.
but that too, yeah. Probably. So all sorts of really, really steamy secrets come out. And there's a wonderful description in your book of the kind of middle-class ladies queuing and jostling to get in. The notion that people want a bit of titillation is also uncovered by the divorce court in a sense, isn't it?
Right. I think the need for titillation is probably older than that. But nonetheless, the divorce court was the only court in England that required barriers to actually regulate spectators because there were so many people desperate to get in. And you have a very vivid sense of the chortling and the kind of response of the audience to what they're actually hearing. And
you mentioned earlier on the importance of the growth of what we would call tabloid newspapers, though they weren't that size a lot of the time when they started out in the 1920s and 1930s. And you talk about very famous journalists like Cudlip and so on. Just give us a sense of how journalism altered to allow much more confession in newspapers. Very fundamentally. So the rise of the divorce court and the rise of the press are very much intertwined. The Daily Telegraph multiplies its subscription by 500% in the years of sort of 1858 to the early 1860s, very much the years of the divorce court. And later on in the 1930s, the divorce court once again becomes a sort of good example of unintended consequences when it pioneers the mass market confession. So what the divorce court as of 1929 does to try to stem the number of divorces that are being brought to the court after the First World War is introduce what's called a discretion statement or a sexual autobiography, so that if you have actually committed adultery, you can get a divorce. This is a change as of 1929, but you have to present to the court a sexual autobiography naming who you've slept with, where, and when. And this is very much fuels the kind of tabloid presentation of what is actually happening again. And at the same time, however, people are writing in to newspapers because they want to confess, they want to tell their story, often anonymised, but people, the notion of telling your story, we're going to come on to television in a little while, but that also happens at this period. Right, it's crucial there because in particular the Daily Mirror does is to pioneer the kind of confessional postcard that we think about as originating, say, with Post Secret or one of those kinds of projects, very much of a modern phenomenon. But in fact, it's much, much older than that. As of the 1930s, the Daily Mirror essentially doubles its own subscription by having
people write in their secrets. So they offer prizes, for instance, for the most intimate pages ripped from your diary, or the 200 words of truth you wish you could tell your spouse. Very much kind of a moment, as I said, where we see a mass market confession in the making.
And we can see that kind of culture very much in today's magazines. I mean, it's still with us, the culture that Cudlip and others created with the Daily Mirror.
That's right. But I would argue, actually, that confessional culture represents really not the end of privacy, but the fullest expression of privacy, meaning privacy has really changed meanings from the Victorians, who, as I said, viewed privacy as being essentially erected on top of secrets, to nowadays, when we think about privacy as meaning the right to live as you wish, either in public or in private. And so, in a sense, privacy for us means the right not to hide.
Alex James, I'd like to bring you on that, because I could see you.
Yeah, I think what's fascinating about Deborah's book is the way you see the contest, if you like, between the interaction between the public space and the private space, and the way the media, in an obvious, mediates those two areas, and you see that in the attitudes towards mentally retarded children. I was fascinated that the Victorians actually had a much more enlightened attitude towards children.
This also comes from Deborah's book, we should say.
Yeah, exactly.
It's fascinating.
And actually, ironically, it's with the emergence of the science of genetics that the private attitudes within families closes down towards that actually shame actually emerges in the 20th century. It's not a linear progression. You see a similar thing with homosexuality, where in the 40s, during the war, there was a kind of brief but rather amazing sort of sense of freedom that homosexuals experience, partly because of everything else that's going on. And then in the 50s, it closes down again. Again, I think this is partly related to McCarthyism. There's a kind of, Burgess and MacLean, there's a whole sense in which homosexuality becomes bound up with, you have Reds under the bed, and now you've got gay Reds under the bed. But you then see the closing down of it. I just think the question I wanted to ask, I suppose, about secrecy and privacy is the Wolfenden Report, which comes out in 1957, seems to me an interesting illustration of the problems of separating secrecy and privacy, because what the Wolfenden Report kind of says is, well, you can have sex with someone of your own sex, provided that you don't do anything about it in public. So it ignores the problem of gay men meeting one another. It says as long as they can meet one another without anyone spotting this, they can then have sex. And so it seems to me that's privacy and secrecy are actually bound more closely together even now.
I'm still unclear as to whether they are different things or whether they're just the same thing looked at from different angles.
Well, I suppose it depends how you play them in society, isn't it? I mean, Alex has picked up on something I think is really fascinating about Deborah's book, which is we always sort of see history as a progress towards more enlightenment. But actually, when you analyse some of the issues in this book, very often people were more enlightened or more tolerant in the past. You mentioned mixed-race marriages or mixed-race children, Attitudes towards race, as Deborah says, in the 18th century were infinitely more tolerant than they became in the 19th century. And certainly from my period further back, attitudes towards illegitimacy have really changed. I work in a period in 15th, 16th, 17th century Europe where men had a great many illegitimate children. Prostitution is the bilge point of the good ship of state, says St. Augustine. You don't want to worry your wife with too much sex, so you go out and have it elsewhere. And the children were not stigmatized at all. In fact, in many big country families, they were brought in to build the dynasty. There's a fantastic aristocrat in Ferrara in Italy in the early 15th century called Niccolo d'Este, who's known as the father of his country because he more or less is literally the father of his country. And he has 27 children, bastards and legitimate, all brought up together, found places in the court, found places in the church. So illegitimacy, which after a while becomes that shaky thing that terrifies everybody.
So what you confess is absolutely crucial. What you feel shame about is crucial. And in the period covered by Deborah's book, which is roughly speaking the last 200 years of British history, it is very much bound up with the story of the nuclear family, isn't it, Deborah?
That's right. The family, full stop. I think when we think about why transformations of the kind that Alex and Sarah are talking about, we think about public events like new laws and demonstrations and those sorts of things. And what I'm trying to do in the book is to understand, how does social transformation happen within the family? In other words, what are the kinds of sea changes that actually happen behind closed doors?
And in terms of that story, what's confessed is still crucial, because that shows you what is acceptable and what is not acceptable.
Right. When what is confessed outside of the family and what is confessed within it, right? It's in the family that people encounter the kinds of dread stigmas that they haven't really before imagined. And then the relatives have to deal with them.
Alex Graham's Who Do You Think You Are stars in your book later on in its own right. And perhaps we should turn to that, Alex, because this was an idea that came out, I think, out of Simon Sharma's History of Britain originally. You were looking at different ways of telling history.
Yeah, I mean, the curious thing is that Who Do You Think You Are is now cited, as part of this broader confessional culture, but to be honest, it was never intended to be that. As you say, actually, my original idea was that was never intended to be a returning series either, was that we would tell the history. It was an alternative History of Britain, an alternative to those rather wonderful history programmes which are presented on BBC One by a range of male history presenters. And I wanted to do it in a different way, and it seemed to me that one way of doing that would be to take a series of well-known, possibly even well-loved celebrities, and trace their family history. And by tracing their family history, we would somehow build, in a compendium way, a different kind of history of Britain. And we set out, interestingly, the very first film we were going to make was with Bill Oddie, much loved presenter, a television presenter, and he was going to be the representative of the Industrial Revolution. He grew up in Rochdale in Lancashire. His family had largely worked in the mills. But when we went to see him, he said, well, I'm not uninterested in the Industrial Revolution, but I'm much more interested in what happened to my mum, who was absent for much of my childhood. We were told she was ill. I suspect it was some form of mental illness, but to be honest, even to this day, I don't know what it was, or indeed how long she was locked up in a mental home. And actually, at the time, Bill was experiencing his own. He'd had a couple of periods of quite serious depression, and he wanted to get to grips with that. And I was faced with a choice, which was this was clearly not the series I had sold to the BBC, but it seemed to me that it was a series, a potentially much more interesting series, a much more compelling series. And so naturally we ended up, instead of telling the history of the Industrial Revolution through Bill's story, we ended up telling the history of how mental illness was treated in the first half of the 20th century.
And you've said, in fact, you're quoted in Deborah Cohen's book saying, actually, this is about the family reasserting itself. What do you mean by that?
Well, I suppose that's partly a personal reflection. I grew up in the 60s, early 70s. Well, I grew up in the 50s and 60s, really, but sort of went to university in the late 60s and was very much part of that left liberal critique of the family. The family was a bourgeois institution. We were going to sweep it away. It was going to be part of the kind of the greater revolution that some of us sadly are still waiting for. And the irony, I suppose, is that I also, my personal experience of family, my father died when I was very young. My mother had a very bad falling out with my grandparents. And I grew up quite cynical about the family, quite cynical about biological ties. And the irony, I suppose, is that I in making Who Do You Think You Are,
you've become the godfather of something which is all about the importance of biological ties.
But I discovered the power of the biological family in particular. That is what has actually, frankly, slightly shocked me in the course of making this series.
Sarah Dunant.
I think what's interesting about the series is it's also about what's been happening to history over the last 30 or 40 years as a discipline, which is it stopped being about literally the famous white men who made history, and it started to be asking about who we, all of us in a popular democracy, might have been in the past. And the series works very well on that regard. I suppose my slight problem with the series, and it picks up something you said at the very early beginning, is that you do use a lot of celebrities to go back into history. And if there is any place where we've got the equivalent of dead, white, black, whatever, men and women now, it's in celebrity culture. And I would prefer to see some really ordinary people going back, as well as celebrities.
I'm going to bring Deborah in quickly before Alex responds to that.
I think the insight, though, that Alex has had about the celebrities is this idea that the celebrity represents the most distilled form of social mobility, right? That they have come very far from where they started, most of them. And I think that that's where Who Do You Think You Are really gets to the universal, which is understanding how social mobility means that uncovering the secrets is not, sort of ties people in closer to their family rather than separating them.
Well, it's interesting. The question I get asked most of all, certainly by the kind of hordes of genealogists who kind of follow the show, is why do you not feature ordinary people? And actually, only slightly facetiously, my answer to that is, well, we do. Actually, we feature ordinary people who just happen to have become famous. And I think that what's interesting about celebrity is, unless your name is Redgrave or Barrymore, by and large, most celebrities are first-generation celebrities. And genealogically speaking, they are the same as you and me. Actually, Deborah's insight, rather interesting reading Deborah's book, that I hadn't really thought about celebrity as the extreme form of social mobility in quite that way until I read it in Deborah's book. But of course she's right. The other thing I'd like to say just quickly, what is really interesting in the context of this discussion, is that actually our celebrities are not in any way cowed by the possibility of notoriety in their families. In fact, if anything, when they sign up, their great fear is that they won't find anything, that actually they will be dull, and actually they crave.
I just want to bring Stephen Grosz in.
Just analytically, thinking about it as a psychoanalyst, I think that celebrities too are a really interesting choice, and they're very compelling because they come freighted with you know something about them, and we lean towards them. We want to know more about them. The episode, or the one with J.K. Rowling, we know she's a private person, and it was incredibly gripping to watch all the things that she went on and did, and my questions were really about what happens when we start to look at going back in history of someone. Is it really about disclosure, or is it just about learning about her past? By which I mean, we might know more about her by just saying, tell me about your mother, or tell me about your relationship to your family. What is it that we learn when we do go back in the past?
You mean a couple of generations back to sort of origin?
Sometimes I'm struck that what I think that we're learning are one of the stories in my book is actually I go back with my father on a kind of, and I'm fascinated by that impulse in myself and in other people. And also, as Deborah points out, how so many people want to go back and find out about their family history.
And the wonderful difference in your book is when you take your father back, he doesn't really want to go. He doesn't want to necessarily be shown his past because it is too difficult and too painful. Whereas in some respects, your program works, Alex, because people are distant enough from the arrival at the secret, so it doesn't necessarily hurt them in the same way.
Well,
so
it doesn't. It doesn't. I think the difficulty. We've made, slightly to my amazement now, we've made getting on for 100 episodes of the show, and I think it's quite difficult to generalise. Certainly some people embrace and enjoy the journey. I'd say the majority of them do. Others find it quite difficult, and of course the show is predicated on the fact that they don't know anything about the journey they are going on. It is slightly like being kidnapped, bundled into a white van and dumped somewhere.
Do you
in
know
Essex.
their journey?
We know their journey because we've got unfortunately we have a schedule and a budget to keep to, so we need to know every detail of their journey, but they know nothing. They don't, from day to day, they don't know anything. The revelations happen on camera as you see them.
And the question is what they're really shocked by and what they're ashamed by. I'm very interested by what Sarah Dunant said earlier on about shame, though, and I'd like to come on to that at this point, because it's clear, if you go back to Deborah Cohen's book, looking at how these things have changed, the things that people find shameful change really quite fast and quite radically. It suddenly becomes unbelievably shameful to have a mixed race child, or to have a child out of wedlock, or to be gay, and then it's not at all shameful to be gay. It's something actually to be proud of. And these things change all the time. Sarah, just a few reflections on you said that shame is important, and we're in danger of losing shame by being in a sense, too open, too confessional?
Well, I suppose because I stand on a longer context from it, I'm always working 500 or 600 years before. It's very interesting to watch how things that we perceive to be shameful come in and out of fashion in their own way and are policed. And I think homosexuality is a really interesting one here because when I look at it 500 or 600 years ago, at one level, it is the worst possible sin as perceived by the Catholic Church. If you look at all the sermons, it will be sodomy that they are railing against. But when you think about how many sermons are railing against sodomy, you suddenly begin to realise they're railing against it because there's clearly a great deal of it around. And then the question is, and it's the big question for all of us around this table in terms of secrets, how do you find out? And that's where the work that people like Deborah have done has been so revolutionary to history, because you're asking history different questions than you used to. You're asking, so where were those secrets hidden? And particularly, for instance, in Florence in the 15th century, you find them in court records. You find them in the people who've done wrong. And there's a fascinating study of the night police in the 15th century in Florence. Their job is to go into dark alleys and look what's going on, and of course sex is going on, and they discover a huge homosexual culture in there, which then when you look at how it's tried and punished, you realise it depends where you are on the social structure. So if you have the name of one of the very big families in Florence and you're arraigned, you'll have a small fine and it'll go against you. If you're a rent boy or the equivalent, you're seen as the female in the sexual conversation, you may, after a third prosecution, lose your nose, because that's what you do to prostitutes. So there's a class system in place which actually defines who is really badly punished and who isn't. But basically underneath there is a tolerance, a complete acceptability of something which on the surface is utterly the worst sin in the world. And of course that is how societies deal with secrets. They know they're there. We all know they're there. Humans are frail. The thing about Catholicism that's so great.
So we've got the tension between empathy, human empathy on the one hand, and the sense there has to be some kind of overarching order on the other. And these two, and secrets are where those two grind together.
And I think it depends also on what the nature of the authority is. I think in a very interesting way, Catholicism, and I was brought up a Catholic for the first 16, 17 years of my life, Catholicism, although it has such a bad name for the guilt and the oppression of guilt, does have within it the notion of absolution through confession. Right? Which, when you come to the Victorian times or whatever, which is much more a Protestant time, is a much harsher one when it comes to dealing with sin. And I'm always looking at situations where people are doing unspeakable things which are being secret, but in the notion of the confessional box could be heard and absolved. Which
was always a fundamental Protestant critique of Catholicism, Absolutely. That it was all too easy. You Absolutely. Just went and said sorry, did a few Hail Marys, and it was okay. Under Protestant thinking, that wasn't the case. Stephen?
I worry just a little bit, I mean, as an analyst, that we're getting away from why people lie or why they tell secrets. And one of the things I liked in Deborah's book very much was I think people lie because of the pain of telling the truth, that they're frightened of what will happen to them or people they love, that they'll hurt people they love or they'll be hurt because of the things that she'll say. And what I thought you captured really well in that, talking about Christians accept the kind of 19th century notion of accepting your children, or things which happened later on of being ashamed of homosexuality or various things, was the notion of a should, that in that gap between how I should be and how I am, there would be just enormous emotional pain, and so I will tell a lie, or I will keep a secret, or I have to do X, Y, and Z in order not to feel that pain, or in order not to cause pain to others too.
Deborah? No. Alex?
I agree with that, but I also think, I mean, we make another series for ITV, a series called Long Lost Family, which is not explicitly historical at all. It's about reuniting families in the present day, reuniting relatives, blood relatives who've been separated, through adoption, illegitimacy. And what is quite clear from making that series, though, is that, and picks up on what Sarah was saying earlier about the shame of illegitimacy, and how actually what is scary is how recent, and how damaging those kind of shameful feelings about illegitimacy were. And we in Long Lost Family, we are dealing with people in their 40s and their 50s who went through that terrible pain. And I suppose my overall concern is that I'm slightly concerned with this notion that somehow we need a bit more shame or a bit more secrecy. I'm passionately of the view that openness, honesty are good things.
But nevertheless, what are people most ashamed by, from your perspective? So I just want to come, just in terms of, as it were, the statistical
well, in terms of
balance of the programme.
In terms of who do you think you are, what's interesting is, as I say, actually people embrace notoriety. You know, we've had bigamy, we've had murder, we've had manslaughter, we've even had Russian roulette in one case.
Paedophilia.
We haven't had paedophilia. We've had that's and it's an interesting question about whether we debate that about whether we would do it or not. We certainly have had. I mean, in all the stories we've done featuring our black celebrities, we have ended up with mixed race rape. I mean, every single one goes back to every single one of our black celebrities here and in America are the product of a mixed race slave
it's quite easy in a sense, because if you are the celebrity, there's nothing for you to feel shame about, is there? It's somebody else's story.
To answer your question directly, what they are most appalled by, shamed by, is not those sexual issues. Actually, what really appalls them and what really shames them is poverty. That's the thing they are most shocked by, is the poverty.
All right, so what are we ashamed of round this table? I mean, we don't have to tell each other, but do we have things that we're ashamed of? I have done things in my life that I am ashamed of.
Me
right?
Too. But so which leads us beautifully to Stephen Grosz, because one of the things is, what are people ashamed? When people come for psychotherapy, it's because they have a block or a problem, and so in a lot of cases they have either done something or they have felt something which they have a big problem with. And so my question is, in a sense, the same questions I was putting to Alex, what are people ashamed of?
I think, I'm not sure that is why people come. I mean, it's one of the things which will happen during an analysis, that people often report that they feel less shame as it goes on, and it's not uncommon that people will say at the end of their analysis, I think a patient said not that long ago to me, that I now like who I am. I'm happy being myself. I've accepted myself. And this is someone who felt deeply ashamed at the beginning of their analysis. I actually think people come to analysis and come into the consulting room because they're in pain. They're suffering. They really have reached a point in their life where things are unbearable. And so that will be often the start of an analysis. They want to change, but the key theme, I think the central theme of my book, is that even though people want to change, it's extraordinarily difficult, as we know. I mean, it's just very, very difficult.
It is certainly a book about change, and it's a series, I should explain to people who haven't read it, series of stories, really, anonymised stories, but real stories about people who've come into your therapy room and about how you have felt and reacted to them.
Yeah.
And I mean, there are so many we could talk about, but there's one, for instance, of a woman whose husband is quite clearly committing adultery. He's got it, having affairs, and she refuses to see it and refuses to accept it. And you're just sitting there listening to the evidence.
Yes, I mean, most of the story. I mean, I can say a little bit more about the book and how that story works, but the idea of that story, of all the stories, is usually that I have a problem. That there's something I'm not understanding, and it's the working out of those problems with the patient. The book, it is 31 stories, basically structured from life, from birth to death, from the early part of life to dying, also from the beginning of my career till the end of my career. But I also have structured them in a way so that it might even feel a bit like an analysis, that you don't know a bit, as you learn something about analysis as you go through. That story about the woman, most of them are a story like that. She doesn't see what's happening. She doesn't want to see what's happening. And the dilemma for me is, how do you help someone see something which is going on in their life, perhaps that they don't want to see, but also that may be causing them great pain. That she doesn't understand why the couple isn't working, why her marriage isn't working, why her husband's relationship to her child isn't working. And it's the unraveling of that over the course of that story.
And you have, we won't go through the 31 stories, but one of the really extraordinary stories involving somebody who's younger is a boy who is just, small boy who is just incredibly abusive to you and spitting at you again and again and again.
Yeah. I mean, what the stories, what I've tried to do in them is to take the things which I thought were most important that I had learned from, and maybe helpful to explain, but I wrote the book. I'm not a young author. It's my first book. I'm 60. And I wrote the book, started writing it when my first child was born, about 10 years ago. I come from a family, my mother died at 64. My father at my age had already had a couple of heart attacks. Part of what I wanted to do was set down those things which I had learned from my patients, which I thought were absolutely the most important thing for my kids and for just to put into a book. So the stories are about how people change, what to do if you're stuck in a relationship, how things which may be problematic, envy in a life, how you might envy someone who a parent might envy a child, why you might not be able to change. So the stories are trying to address problems, and I use clinical material. I use things from my experience as a clinician to illustrate those points. And
what's really interesting about what Stephen just said is that he wrote it partly to understand himself and to help himself from what he'd learned. And I think that is, if we're talking about confession, which is also running through this program, and you look at kind of three models of confession through history, the first being the good old-fashioned Catholic model of confession, then one of the things that it had about it was not only were you absolved, but at the best, the person absolving you was also on their own personal journey with a higher authority to them to mediate their behaviour, which was God. And one of the ways in which that template works so well when you move to analysis is, of course, the analyst isn't alone. You are being analysed yourself. In one of the best stories, you talk about how this is flummoxing for me and I went to see my superior to help me through. And then when you move on to the contemporary world, where in a sense the media's taken over as the forum for confession and people confess publicly, I'm sure all of us around this table who've ever made a program will have had the experience of getting somebody to talk about something painful or difficult, where they give you their secret, whether you go away and you edit it down to a certain amount of time and you put it out on the air, and you in a sense don't have the responsibility towards them that either the priest or the analyst did. It's a difficult, dangerous area, public confession, without responsibility above it, don't you think?
Psychoanalysis seems to me to be very much based on the notion that to tell the secret, even simply to the analyst, and to makes you healthy, is a good and healthy thing. Is it always healthy to tell secrets?
I think sometimes one of the I would find it very peculiar if a patient came in and told me their secrets. Right. They have to learn to trust. And actually one of the questions of an analysis will be the long period of time of watching someone and how they test you out and how they find if you are trustworthy or not. So it'd be peculiar if someone immediately came in and said whatever it is they have to say. That can take a very, very long time. That's why analysis sometimes takes a long time.
Whereas public confession is immediate, and the fame of it is immediate, but I often wonder about the exposure and the aftermath.
And I think that's right. And actually, one of the refreshing things about Stephen's book, I came to it slightly sceptically because it seems part of a kind of subgenre. That I've read several books like this, and unfortunately, they all suffer from this, in my experience, of the psychoanalyst as hero. And what was really good about Stephen's book was it was about him wrestling with those problems as much as his patients wrestling. But I agree with Sarah. I think my concern is that, and I'm not saying this is necessarily what you are saying, but the danger in this debate is that the media is seen as the cause of this problem, whereas I think what is perhaps more likely going on is we have a kind of, and Who Do You Think You Are is an interesting example of this. We have a kind of vacuum, a moral, if you like, vacuum in a sort of late capitalist society. And people talk, interestingly, genealogy is one of the ways in which people, I think, have turned to try to deal with the sense of their lack of understanding of their place in the world and their place in the universe. And I think it's almost like the decline of religion, which I have to say, by and large, I think is a good thing, but it nonetheless leaves a vacuum. And I think how we fill that vacuum is a really interesting question.
I'm still, we've been kicking the media a bit one way or another in the course of the discussion, but it seems to me that through almost all human history, we were in tribes and small villages and closely packed early towns, and people did know each other's secrets. Everybody could see everybody else, smell, hear everybody else, talked about everybody else. And all that's happened is, as we've become bigger societies, the media has flowed in to take the place of what was going on all the time in alleys and taverns and back streets.
Right.
Deborah.
For some of the people whose records that I looked at, I'm thinking about one woman, Celia Ward, who wants to adopt a baby right after the First World War, and she takes the child to a nursing home. She finds the youngest baby that the Adoption Society has. She takes it to a nursing home and introduces it to everyone as her own child. That's partly possible only because she lives in a big city, right?
Yes.
Other adopters move towns. They forge birth certificates. There's a sort of degree of an anonymity that's guaranteed.
A final thought, Stephen. Do you feel in any sense that you replace, picking up from what Alex was saying, you replace the confessional priest in a more secular society?
No, I don't think that. I mean, I thought the thing Sarah was saying of the consolations of talking to someone, of the intimacy of that, of the hopefully another person understanding, to some degree perhaps, but no, I see it's quite different.
Well, we've come to the end of our consoling and completely intimate conversation on which nobody has been eavesdropping at all. Thank you to all my guests, Alex Graham, who's working on the 10th series of Who Do You Think You Are, Sarah Dunant's Blood and Beauty, that's the Borgia's book's going to be coming out in May, Deborah Cohen's Family Secrets, Living with Shame from the Victorians to the Present Day, and Stephen Grosz's The Examined Life are both out now. Next week, fiscal cliff, squeezed middle and hard-working families. Yes, we are looking at political writing. George Orwell, eat your heart out with Chris Mullen, Tim Montgomery, Joan Bakewell and Phil Collins. But for now, thank you and goodbye.
There are many more Radio 4 arts and discussion programmes to download for free. Find these on the website at bbc.co.uk/Radio 4.
In fact, confessional culture has a much older history.
Alex Graham, your TV programme, Who Do You Think You Are, actually appears in Deborah's book as part of the history of the confessional culture. So do you think things have changed?
I think they've changed by degree. Whether they've changed quantitatively, I'm not so sure. I think what we've seen is a kind of democratisation of confession, and I think that is not altogether a bad thing, although I'm actually more concerned probably with the growth of celebrity culture than with confessional culture. And I think those two things sometimes get conflated when we talk about the media. And I think actually, by and large, what we call our confessional culture is a good thing. Celebrity culture, I think, is a more nuanced and difficult thing.
I really want to come back and talk about the difference between those two things later on. But Sarah Dunant, you've obviously been steeped in the Renaissance and in earlier periods of family history where there are all kinds of... Thank you for downloading the Start the Week podcast from BBC Radio 4. For more information, go to bbc.co.uk/Radio 4. Well, January is a time for stock-taking, reflection and sometimes remorse. That's true most obviously when it comes to bodies and bank accounts, but it also affects our emotions and our family lives. The Christmas break should, of course, be a time of family happiness, but it can also be a time of tension and confrontation. And January is notoriously a month of the year for breakups. So today we're going to be looking at family secrets. What's the difference between privacy and secrecy? How do we examine and explain ourselves? I'm going to try to give modern Britain's confessional culture some historical context. Alex Graham created the television programme Who Do You Think You Are? Sarah Dunant's novels have focused on dark corners of Renaissance families, her new ones about that famously functional family, the Borgias. Public confession, voluntary and otherwise. Do you think we live in a particularly confessional time now?
We live in a publicly confessional time, in a media confessional time, whereas before shame and secrets were kept very underneath. I suppose my bigger question is whether or not shame is a useful thing. to have within a society. And the more we confess, and in a sense, the more we absolve by public confession, have we lost a social control of shame, which actually is for the good?
It doesn't matter what you do, as long as you stand up and you say, you know, I have sinned, I have done the wrong thing. Everybody then loves you again and you go back to life as normal. That's the problem, is it?
Well, I suspect if you were, for instance, to look at the kind of massive meltdown of finance in our country, and you were to look at how we moved from the word debt, which we saw as shame many years ago, into credit, which we saw as growth, and then you asked why bankers made such a hash of money that they didn't even feel belonged to them properly because money didn't mean the same thing, then you ask, when all of that falls apart, why nobody is more shameful about it. So there are ways in which I think shame is quite a good thing in a society.
Well, there's yet another path through the forest that we will try to get to later on for that. Stephen, you know, for a long time the therapy room was where the doors closed and you were completely locked in a private space. What do you think, as a psychotherapist, about the more confessional, as I say, the sort of social networking culture where people seem to be much keener to tell everybody else and show pictures about what they've been doing?
I think actually that I think that things are maybe more complex.
Stephen Grosz is a psychoanalyst who is now telling stories, anonymous stories, but real ones, from his London therapy room. And we're going to be kicking off with Deborah Cohen, who's written a book, well, it's all in the title really, Family Secrets, Living with Shame from the Victorians to the Present Day. Just as we get started, everybody, we do live, it's often said, in a much more open and confessional culture. We've got all the social networking sites, we've got a more confessional style of television, perhaps. Do you think anything has really changed? Deb?
Definitely things have changed. So confession itself is very old. The Church of England long had the rule, none must, all may, some should. But really the mass market confession began to take shape in the 1930s with confessional contests in the tabloids and the rise of marriage therapy in the 1940s. So while I think that there's a difference in degree and in kind,